2012 was an eventful year. Everyone believed it to be the last year any human being would ever experience. Devastating news. However, since 2012 was also a good year for the gaming industry, coping was no big deal, with the horror genre enjoying a peak in popularity through the release of Minecraft's 1.4.2 pretty scary update, but also through the release of a game that I will forever hold dear to my heart.
Who's that?
Cryofear's release was awaited patiently, mainly so that people could watch the funny Swedish man scream at his monitor again, but also because it was believed, and rightfully so, to forever establish itself as one of the best survival horror titles available. Now, as grateful as I am for Cryofear, and as much as I would like to talk about it, I probably will in the future, this game wouldn't have come to be without its spiritual predecessor and the actual topic of this video, Afraid of Monsters. Afraid of Monsters is a dated title, released as a mod for Half-Life in 2005 and receiving a director's cut 2 years later, which I will be focusing on in this video. You already know who used this as another opportunity to entertain the masses.
What is this? Hell?
One thing I'd like everyone to keep in mind before we continue, the developer Andreas Rönnberg, also known as Rumpel, started working on Afraid of Monsters when he was just 12 years old. Creating an entire horror mod by yourself at such a young age is not only incredibly impressive, but also a valid excuse for its little bumps in quality. Which ones am I talking about? Well, let's take a look. The game begins with a quick tour through the well-lit, sterile, yet suspiciously empty Markland Hospital. The track that accompanies this cutscene in the director's cut is a copyrighted Aphex Twin song. In the original Afraid of Monsters, however, Rumpel used a self-made recording of a song that randomly played on the radio way back in the early 2000s. The interesting thing about it is that no one knows its name, not even Rumpel. No one was yet able to identify who it was made by. Very spooky. Next we get to see a man in his late 20s, David Leatherhoff. He's apparently been delivered unnamed painkillers on a regular basis by an unknown company. For free. So this definitely doesn't play in America. Much like any adult with an abundance of free time would, he's been downing these pills without questioning their mere existence, and has since then struggled with addiction, seeking medical assistance in Markland Hospital. Upon arriving in the bathroom, however, a burning temptation awaits him. Whether he brought the pills himself or just so happened to find them here doesn't matter. I mean, he has already admitted himself to the hospital. He's going to quit. One last hit certainly won't do no harm. Right? Completely disoriented, we find ourselves in a nightmarish hell. We follow the instructions and therefore the red, which very quickly leads to panicked breathing and paranoia. With the red usually being connected to the pills, it's safe to say that they aren't doing David much good. If, you know, the environment didn't already sell that. After waking up and leaving the stall, we find the mirror shattered with an all too familiar eye behind it, blood on the floor, and the sun already set. We've been unconscious for hours. If the hospital being completely empty didn't already make it clear enough, spooky PNGs, more blood, and the weapons strewn about this place make sure that we get a feeling like something is off. Armed and supplied with batteries, a gun, ammo, and even the pills that don't have any use as of yet, we come across a note that requests a temporary power shutdown. And with no other option left, we head to the generators and comply with the request. Surely nothing could go wrong in a horror game after turning off the lights, right? Right? Any resemblance of normality is entirely stripped away after flicking the switch, with the only one having to bear the consequences being us and us alone. The consequences being our first encounter with the so-called Twitchers, and looking at them, it's obvious where that name originated from. It's genius how the only one to blame here is us. We not only made the choice to take the final hit, we also intentionally turned off the lights, probably causing an intense bad trip, with the lines between imagination and reality blurring to the point of becoming one. This is also where the pills we found earlier come into play. They function as healing items, the only way to heal. But we already know that they are causing a lot more damage than good, so what exactly are they keeping alive? Is it actually us, or are they keeping alive this nightmare? After finally leaving the hospital, we continue our aimless stroll through apartment blocks, alleys, sewers, and an overcrowded subway station, where we leave behind a huge bloodbath. They're all ordinary places, for many integral parts of their everyday lives. Along the way, we encounter a plethora of different enemy types, including handicapped Twitchers, dogs that cause an explosion so powerful you'd still die from it 2 continents over, and spooky floating faces. In all seriousness, the variety is superb, and although the ordinary Twitchers are still by far my favorite out of all of them, Afraid of Monsters just wouldn't be the same without all the enemies spitting cue balls and whatever this is at you. The graphics perfectly strike the balance of being just comprehensible while still lacking in enough detail to the point of your brain having to compensate. In that regard, the music isn't that much different. While it does always have a recognizable rhythm to it, some of the tracks are still lacking any actual melody, sometimes just consisting of unapologetically rough metal beats. It feels unpolished, unfinished at times, and I adore Afraid of Monsters for that. Horror games that appear too polished and clean always have a harder time actually scaring me. I can somewhat know what to expect, and more importantly, what not to expect. If nothing is left up to your imagination, the player can get too comfortable. An unpolished game, however, means a less comprehensible experience, and we all know that your worst enemy when it comes to fear is your own psyche, being able to come up with answers that are especially terrifying to you specifically. By having so many rough edges, Afraid of Monsters perfectly harnesses our inherent fear of the unknown. Overwhelmed by all this madness, David steals a car in an attempt to flee from everything that's been happening. He's so far gone that he forgot taking the pills. He does not recognize that what's currently happening is not tied to anything external, but his own substance-altered perception. And driving under such an influence goes exactly as expected. Driving feels like a never-ending maze. The meanings and arrangements of the traffic signs are beyond any means of understanding David can currently muster up, either being confusing or sometimes even misleading. We try our best to interpret them correctly, but we're completely zooted. Man's probably committed 17 different traffic violations in the span of 5 minutes. A group of Twitchers causes David to swerve, losing control of the vehicle and crashing into the woods. Interestingly, if we take the alternative route, this happens. Being stopped by the police does sound plausible. After all, we're still intoxicated and bee-hopping through the streets, apparently trespassing through areas we're not even meant to be at. But why they would open fire on us is still unclear. I mean, it kinda isn't, to be honest. You probably figured it out already, but don't spoil it for the rest, alright? Whatever path we choose, we end up in Markland Forest and continue our escape on foot. One thing I've noticed at this point is that Afraid of Monsters doesn't give you any breaks. This becomes clear pretty quickly once you look at the soundtrack, which primarily consists of the industrial, panic-inducing sounds of metal clanging. Horror games usually make use of this duality between sheer terror and sudden serenity. The Silent Hill games are probably the first example that come to mind for this, but Rumpel did it himself phenomenally in Cry of Fear, having utterly panic-inducing sections being followed by a calmness that has made it 10 times more enjoyable and rewarding because of the terror we had to endure prior. But Afraid of Monsters doesn't grant you any sense of calmness whatsoever. Enemies lurk around every single corner. You're constantly on edge, only being relieved once you've fought every single enemy in the vicinity, and even then, you just cannot shake this constant unease. But fear not, because it is here where we find the fire axe, and oh boy. The kitchen knife was basically a continuous back and forth until one of you dropped dead. The hammer was significantly better, but required skilled timing, since David always takes his sweet time to wind up his absolutely devastating swings. But the fire axe combines the attack speed of the kitchen knife with the damage output of the hammer. In other words, it's absolutely broken, and I ended up pretty much lumberjacking through the last third of the game. It's fun though, to be honest. Having fought through the woods, we come across a mansion that apparently includes a secret basement. According to the save file, this is our heaven, which, depending on the path you chose earlier, may include a corrupted version of the Markland Hospital. It's another, not so subtle hint at what is actually going on. David's surroundings begin to make less and less sense. The structure ceases to serve any plausible purpose. Blood, enemies, and supplies pile up until we again follow the red for one last time. A final onslaught of enemies serves as a sort of boss fight, and upon surviving and escaping the arena, we spot a light at the end of the tunnel. This is where the penny finally drops. This whole time, David was going through a drug-induced psychosis. Although an opioid-induced psychosis is usually very unlikely, it isn't impossible, and apart from that, we don't actually know what else these pills contain. It might just be an amphetamine, or even a hallucinogenic, anything that would favor the odds of a substance-induced psychosis. Popping the pills one last time caused David's deepest and darkest parts of his psyche to physically manifest, causing him to believe he was merely defending himself, when in reality, many of the creatures we encountered were actual living beings.
What the dog doing?
Human beings that were either trying to help him, trying to stop him, or merely trying to go about their day. And we went on a psychotic rampage, killing everything in our path. They weren't the monsters, it was us. The second and third ending are a continuation of the first one. In the second ending, David's psychosis finally died down and he's being interrogated. Not having any memories of the events prior, he claims to not have been fully aware of his actions. Even if it doesn't undo what happened, he does show remorse. And after finally reaching the light at the end of the tunnel, we get to see the conclusion to David's story in the third ending. A couple days have gone by since the incident. The news are naturally all over it, stating that David's killing spree claimed over 27 victims. Man's been racking up multiple kill streaks. It's that grind state, you know? He's since then been serving time in prison. Remember him showing remorse in the second ending? Well, the third ending makes it apparent that this remorse was actually real. But what if I were to tell you that there is a fourth ending? An ending that we can achieve if we follow the notes strewn about the city, containing a letter and a corresponding number to it. Rearranging them gives us a cohesive sentence, "Forgive me," and therefore the right code. So, what if we choose the path of forgiveness, realize the destructive nature of the pills, and actually intend change? How would that affect David's perception? While this version of the Markland Hospital is even more twisted than the previous ones, what's entirely missing here is blood and enemies, which is a very good sign. According to our save file, this isn't our heaven anymore. It's now labeled for Mother. I don't know why it's called that specifically, but it does sound like a redemption arc. The previous trips, as disturbing as they were, offered David a relief from the withdrawal. He didn't want to take the pills, he had to. But now he's finally fighting back. He finally admits that this isn't heaven, but hell disguised as such. And to finally wake up from this nightmare, we must fight its origin, our addiction. Finally confronting our dark side, we quickly realize that we have a huge disadvantage. Any damage we inflict on our addiction is directly harming us, so any ammo you saved up until now is completely useless. The only weapon that works is a spear we can find down here. So, stabbing ourselves again and again and again, we finally end the fight victoriously. The effort was worth it. In the fourth and best ending, the hallucinations of David's drug-induced psychosis remained in his mind. No one except for David himself was harmed, and after a long struggle, he narrowly escaped death from an overdose. In the case of an opioid overdose, those affected can be administered naloxone, which binds to the opioid receptors and rapidly reverses the effects of an overdose. Maybe that's why the spear, or some kind of syringe, was the only weapon capable of harming our addiction. That does sound pretty far-fetched, I know, but don't ruin the fun, alright? You clicked on an in-depth analysis of a horror game, what did you expect? So, we made it. David went through the most traumatizing experience of his life and won the fight. Many consider this to be a happy ending, and on the surface that may be true, but there is a problem. As long as you don't look up the code for the fourth ending, you wouldn't do that, would you? You are required to play through all three main endings in order to gather every single piece of paper. You have to experience this tragedy first in order to get the happy ending. I believe this ending to be more wishful thinking rather than an actual conclusion. Furthermore, David's behavior has continuously been extremely reckless, showing no regard for the safety of others or his own. The scar below his right eye, the incessant consumption of an unknown substance, stealing someone's car, driving under the influence, and completely wrecking said car, and the repeated use of violence. David truly is a menace to society. One may be led to believe that after achieving this ending, the cycle would just begin anew. He'd relapse, seek medical assistance again, and be presented with the same decision. He will always have the option to seek forgiveness, but one day, his strength will no longer suffice, and David will no longer find forgiveness. But hey, maybe I'm completely ruining the joy of an actual happy ending. Let's not overanalyze it, and instead just be happy for David. I'm pretty sure he'll be grateful enough for a second chance. He won't make the same mistake twice.